Before we begin this deep dive into the hidden history of organized crime, it is crucial to state that the following narrative is a compilation of facts, historical accounts, court documents, and declassified FBI wiretap transcripts. The purpose of this presentation is solely to deliver a comprehensive and accurate account of these events for educational and informational purposes. The story you are about to hear is not a work of fiction. It is the real, unvarnished saga of power, betrayal, and ambition that unfolded in the shadows of America. If you are ready to hear the true story of the man who inspired television's most famous mobster, then listen closely, because the world of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante is more shocking than any scripted drama. The story of Sam DeCavalcante begins not in the gritty industrial landscapes of New Jersey, where he would eventually build his empire, but in the sun-baked, rugged hills of Sicily, a land steeped in old-world traditions and a silent, ancient code of honor and vendetta that its people carried in their blood like a genetic memory. Born in 1912 in the town of Sciacca, Salvatore DeCavalcante was immersed in a culture where family was the ultimate fortress, loyalty was the highest currency, and respect was a commodity more valuable than any amount of gold. This was not the romanticized version of the Mafia that would later captivate audiences on television screens. This was the real, unspoken structure of society, the cosca, the artichoke where each leaf protected the heart. As a young boy, he was brought to the United States, his family seeking the promise and prosperity that America offered in waves to the countless immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. They settled in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a bustling, rapidly industrializing city that was becoming a melting pot for Sicilians and other immigrants, all searching for their own piece of the American dream. For many, that dream was found through hard, honest labor in the factories and docks, but for young Salvatore, the landscape presented a different kind of opportunity, one that existed in the shadows of those very same factories, in the backrooms of social clubs, and on the streets where a different kind of law was enforced. The Elizabeth of his youth was a territory ripe for the taking, a prize fiercely contested by various criminal factions, many of which answered to the powerful and sprawling crime families already entrenched across the river in New York City. It was in this environment that Salvatore DeCavalcante learned his first and most crucial lessons about power, territory, and the delicate balance of fear and respect. He was not a brash, loudmouthed thug. Even from an early age, those who knew him remarked on his quiet, observant nature, his ability to listen more than he spoke, and his sharp, calculating mind that preferred strategy over brute force. He understood that true power was not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the voice that, when it finally did speak, everyone else felt compelled to listen to. He started, as many did, in the traditional rackets of the era. Numbers running, small-scale loan sharking, and protecting local businesses from threats that often originated from his own organization. It was during this time that he earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the Plumber. While the popular myth suggests this was a cover for his illicit activities, the truth was more literal and far more insightful into his character. His family was genuinely in the plumbing supply business, and Sam worked in it, learning a legitimate trade. This duality became the cornerstone of his entire philosophy. He was a businessman, first and foremost, who understood the value of a legitimate front, the importance of blending into the fabric of everyday society, and the critical need to have a visible, taxable source of income that could withstand scrutiny from the authorities. He wasn't just playing a role, he was building a foundation, both above ground and below it. This methodical, patient approach set him apart from the more volatile and flashy gangsters of the era. While others sought immediate notoriety and the flashy rewards of crime, Sam was playing a much longer game, investing in relationships, building a network of loyal associates, and meticulously carving out a small but stable piece of territory for himself. He understood that the New York families, the so-called five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, viewed New Jersey as their backyard, a useful territory for dumping bodies or running operations too hot for the city, but not as a sovereign state deserving of its own ruling family. This perception was the invisible cage that Sam DeCavalcante would spend the better part of his life trying to break out of. His rise was not meteoric. It was a slow, deliberate climb, a careful consolidation of power that happened one relationship, one business deal, and one eliminated rival at a time. He paid his dues, offered his respect to the established New York bosses, and ensured that his operations ran smoothly and, most importantly, profitably for everyone involved, including his powerful neighbors. He built a reputation not as a reckless killer, though he was capable of ordering violence when he deemed it necessary for business, but as a man of his word, a reliable earner, and a calm, rational leader who could be reasoned with. This reputation for reliability and business acumen was his greatest asset, allowing him to form crucial alliances with figures in the Genovese and Gambino families, relationships that would later provide him with the political cover needed to solidify his own family's standing. By the time the 1950s arrived, Sam DeCavalcante was no longer just a capable street boss. He was the undisputed leader of what was now being referred to as the DeCavalcante Crime Family, an organization with its roots deeply planted in New Jersey soil, controlling a vast and lucrative portfolio of illegal enterprises from loan sharking and gambling to the infiltration of labor unions and the burgeoning construction industry along the Jersey Shore and in the major industrial centers of the state. He had successfully transformed a collection of disjointed crews into a cohesive, disciplined, and financially powerful criminal corporation, answering not to New York, but to him, from his base in a quiet, unassuming office in Kenilworth. This was the rise, the careful, patient construction of an empire built not on bombast, but on balance sheets, and it was this very empire that would soon be thrust into the blinding, unforgiving light of a federal investigation, an investigation that would ironically, and forever, cement his name in American criminal legend not through his deeds alone, but through the private, unguarded words he never meant for the world to hear. The transformation of the loose confederation of New Jersey-based crews into the formal DeCavalcante Crime Family was a masterclass in strategic foresight and quiet, relentless ambition, a process that mirrored the industrial ascent of the state itself, evolving from a network of small-time operations into a sophisticated corporate-like entity with Sam as its chief executive. This period of consolidation and expansion throughout the 1950s and early 1960s was not marked by the bloody, public gang wars that had characterized the rise of other crime families, but rather by a series of calculated business decisions, strategic alliances, and the ruthless, yet discreet, elimination of obstacles, both internal and external. Sam's genius lay in his understanding that the real power, the enduring power, was not seized with a gun alone but was built through control over the economic lifeblood of the communities he operated in. And nowhere was this more evident than in his methodical takeover of the labor unions and the construction industry. He recognized that these sectors were the perfect confluence of legitimate enterprise and illicit opportunity, a vast river of cash flow that could be dammed, diverted, and tapped into for immense, steady profit. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, with its control over every truck that rolled in and out of the state's ports, factories, and construction sites, became a primary target, and through a combination of coercion, corruption, and the strategic placement of his own associates in positions of union authority, Sam effectively gained a stranglehold on the movement of goods throughout New Jersey. A business that refused to play ball with his demands would suddenly find its deliveries halted, its supplies mysteriously lost, or its drivers threatened, and the message was always clear. To do business in New Jersey, you had to do business with the DeCavalcante family. Similarly, the construction boom that was reshaping the state's skyline presented an even richer vein to mine. Through his control of unions and his network of owned companies, he could dictate which construction firms won lucrative public and private contracts, forcing them to hire his corrupt, no-show workers, use his overpriced and often stolen materials, and pay a regular tribute, a tax, for the privilege of operating without labor troubles or accidents on their sites. This was not simple extortion. It was a deeply embedded, parasitic control over the very infrastructure of the state, generating millions of dollars that were then funneled back into his other enterprises, both legal and illegal, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth and influence. His power became so pervasive that it was almost invisible, woven into the concrete of the new office buildings and the asphalt of the new highways, a silent partner in the great American project of post-war expansion. This business-minded approach earned him a unique level of respect from the powerful commission in New York, the governing body of the American Mafia, which was comprised of the bosses of the 5 families. They saw in Sam not a rival to be crushed, but a valuable and stable associate, a reliable earner who kept the peace in a territory that had historically been turbulent. He was invited to sit in on high-level meetings, his counsel was sought on disputes, and he was treated, for all intents and purposes, as an equal, a monumental achievement for a boss operating outside of New York City. This recognition was the pinnacle of his ambitions, the formal acknowledgement that New Jersey was no longer a mere satellite but a sovereign entity in the underworld galaxy. He carried himself with the demeanor of a corporate chairman, well-spoken, always impeccably dressed, avoiding the flashy jewelry and loud demeanor of his contemporaries, preferring to conduct his business from his plumbing supply office or over quiet dinners at Italian restaurants in Newark's ironbound district. He preached a doctrine of discretion and financial prudence to his soldiers, warning them against the flashy lifestyles that drew the attention of the IRS and the FBI. He was building a dynasty, not just a criminal enterprise, and he envisioned a future where his family would remain a dominant force for generations to come. A quiet, powerful institution as enduring as any of the legitimate corporations whose boards he would never sit on. Yet, this very success, this deep integration into the fabric of the economy, was what made him a prime target for a new, more sophisticated generation of federal law enforcement. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had finally acknowledged the existence of a national organized crime syndicate, and they began to shift their tactics from arresting individual gangsters for discrete crimes to dismantling the entire structure of these families through long-term, intelligence-driven investigations. And it was this shift in strategy that would lead federal agents to a seemingly innocuous building on Adams Street in Kenilworth, New Jersey, where, in the spring of 1964, they would plant a listening device that would peel back the curtain on Sam DeCavalcante's carefully constructed world, capturing his voice, his thoughts, his fears, and his secrets, and providing an unprecedented, real-time audio diary of a mafia boss in his natural habitat, a treasure trove of evidence that would become known as the DeCavalcante tapes, and in doing so, would immortalize him in a way he never could have imagined. The installation of the FBI's electronic listening device in the small, cluttered office above the Kenilworth Plumbing Supply Company in the spring of 1964 was a watershed moment in the history of American law enforcement. A silent invasion that would transform the abstract concept of organized crime into a tangible, breathing entity with a name, a voice, and a startlingly human face. For years, the Bureau had struggled to penetrate the omerta, the code of silence that shielded families like the DeCavalcantes. But with this single, clandestine act, they bypassed the walls of fear and loyalty entirely, placing a microphone at the very heart of the beast. The agents listening in those first days could not have known they were about to record one of the most comprehensive and intimate portraits of mafia life ever captured. A sprawling audio epic that would run for thousands of hours and provide a granular, unvarnished look into the daily operations, internal politics, and personal anxieties of a criminal organization at the peak of its power. The man whose voice dominated these recordings, Sam DeCavalcante, was revealed not as a one-dimensional monster from a gangster film, but as a complex, often contradictory figure. A ruthless boss who could order a murder with chilling calmness, yet also a weary CEO frustrated with the incompetence and insubordination of his middle management. A man who spoke eloquently about honor and tradition, while simultaneously lamenting the greed and short-sightedness of the newer generation of mobsters. A criminal mastermind who was constantly worried about money, about rivals, about the relentless pressure from the law. The tapes became a real-time window into the immense burden of command in the underworld, a world where every conversation could be a negotiation for life or death, and every alliance was a temporary convenience waiting to be betrayed. The FBI heard Sam mediating disputes between his capos, meticulously planning the intricacies of a loan-sharking operation, and discussing the delicate art of skimming money from union pension funds. They listened as he strategized with his underboss, Frank Mayui, and his consigliere, Joseph Sfera, debating the merits of expanding into Atlantic City's nascent gambling scene or the risks of moving against a crew from the Gambino family that was encroaching on their turf in Elizabeth. The sheer banality of much of the conversation was as revealing as the criminal conspiracies. They complained about the quality of the coffee, gossiped about each other's personal lives, and worried about their health, humanizing these men in a way that newspaper headlines about gangland slayings never could. This humanity, however, was punctuated by moments of stark, brutal reality. In one chilling session, the agents listened as Sam calmly gave the order for the murder of an associate who had fallen out of favor, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a plumbing invoice, a stark reminder that beneath the boardroom demeanor was a man who held the power of life and death over his subordinates. Yet, perhaps the most significant revelation from the tapes was the detailed confirmation of the DeCavalcante family's direct and operational connection to the Commission in New York, shattering any remaining illusion of New Jersey's independence. Sam was heard speaking directly with powerful bosses like Carlo Gambino and Tommy Luchis, addressing them with respect but also as a peer, discussing shared business interests and seeking approval for major decisions, providing the FBI with an organizational chart of the American Mafia that was more accurate than any they had ever pieced together from informants. For years, the agents meticulously transcribed every word, building an insurmountable mountain of evidence that detailed hundreds of crimes, from extortion and racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder. The pressure on Sam and his organization began to intensify almost imperceptibly at first, as seemingly random arrests and grand jury subpoenas started to chip away at his crew, creating a pervasive paranoia that he himself discussed on the very tapes the FBI was recording. He lamented the heat, worried about who was talking, and fretted over the financial strain of legal defenses. His own words painting a portrait of a king slowly realizing his castle was under siege from within its own walls. The very device that captured his rise and reign was now meticulously documenting his own growing sense of entrapment, a tragic irony that seemed lost on him as he continued to conduct his business, unaware that every strategy session, every confident boast, and every fearful whisper was being faithfully preserved on reels of magnetic tape in a nearby federal building. Each rotation bringing the inevitable downfall of his empire one step closer to reality. The slow, inexorable tightening of the federal noose around Sam DeCavalcante's organization, meticulously built from the very words captured on their own hidden microphones, created a climate of suffocating paranoia that began to corrode the foundations of loyalty and discipline he had worked so hard to instill. 4 years, the FBI patiently allowed the tapes to roll, accumulating an overwhelming body of evidence, not just on Sam, but on every captain, soldier, and associate who walked into his office, their voices and their crimes immortalized on thousands of pages of transcript. This was not a swift, surgical strike. It was a strategic, protracted siege designed to collapse the entire structure from the inside out. The first public cracks appeared not with the dramatic arrest of the boss himself, but with a series of targeted indictments against his key lieutenants, charges so specific and well documented that they could only point to one terrifying conclusion. There was a mole, or worse, the walls themselves had ears. Sam, ever the pragmatist, initially dismissed these setbacks as the cost of doing business, the predictable ebb and flow of a life in the underworld. But as the cases mounted and the evidence presented in court began to quote his own private conversations verbatim, a cold dread must have settled in his stomach. The world he had controlled so absolutely was suddenly transparent, his every move anticipated, his most confidential discussions laid bare for prosecutors and juries to dissect. The FBI's strategy was psychological warfare as much as it was a legal one. They wanted the family to tear itself apart, to let the seed of suspicion grow into a vine of betrayal. This pressure manifested most dangerously in the internal dynamics of the family. The younger, more impulsive soldiers, who had not lived through the leaner, more cautious years of building the organization, grew restless under the constant scrutiny. They saw the legal battles draining the family's coffers and the boss's attention focused on survival rather than expansion. Whispers of Sam being too cautious, too old school, began to circulate, a dangerous heresy in a world where the boss's authority was supposed to be absolute. The very business-minded approach that had earned him respect from New York now made him vulnerable to challenges from within from those who favored a more aggressive, confrontational style. The tapes from this period reveal a man increasingly burdened, not just by the external enemy, but by the crumbling of his own internal command structure. He could be heard lecturing his men on the importance of staying quiet, of keeping a low profile, his voice laced with a frustration that bordered on despair. He knew the government's case was being built word by word, and he was powerless to stop it, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. The final, crushing blow came when the full scope of the wiretap evidence was finally unveiled in a series of federal indictments that named Sam DeCavalcante and nearly his entire administration in a sweeping racketeering case. The charges were a comprehensive catalogue of his life's work: conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and murder. For the first time, the public and the underworld got a glimpse of the astonishing intimacy of the surveillance. News reports detailed how the FBI knew not only what crimes he had ordered, but what he had for lunch, what he thought of his nephew's new girlfriend, and his complaints about his ulcer. The legend of the plumber was now permanently fused with the humiliation of his own wiretapped musings. Facing the rest of his life in prison, Sam was forced to make a series of impossible choices. The once powerful boss, who had negotiated with Carlo Gambino as an equal, was now reduced to a defendant, his fate in the hands of a legal system he had spent his entire life circumventing. The trials that followed were a media sensation, not for their violence, but for their unprecedented audio component. Jurors listened, mesmerized and often horrified, as the calm, reasoned voice of Sam DeCavalcante discussed criminal enterprises with the cool detachment of a stockbroker analyzing a portfolio. It was the end of an era, the dramatic unmasking of a shadow government that had operated with impunity for decades. The myth of the honorable, untouchable Mafia boss was shattered by the boss's own words, revealing the organization to be exactly what Sam had always, in a way, treated it as: a business, albeit a vicious and illegal one, populated by flawed, greedy, and frightened men. His conviction was a foregone conclusion, the inevitable culmination of the thousands of hours of testimony he had inadvertently provided against himself. As he was led from the courtroom, the empire he had built so carefully, the control over the unions, the construction rackets, the web of fear and respect, began to instantly disintegrate, leaving behind a power vacuum that would be filled by weaker, more volatile men, ensuring that the decline of the DeCavalcante family would be as swift and certain as its rise had been deliberate and calculated. The conviction and subsequent imprisonment of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante did not merely represent the fall of a single man. It was a catastrophic systems failure for the entire criminal empire he had architected, a meticulously engineered machine that could not function without its chief designer at the controls. The federal prison walls that closed around him in the early 1970s acted as a dam, holding back the immense pressure of the internal rivalries, financial anxieties, and external threats that he had personally managed for 2 decades. And with his guiding hand removed, the structure began to fissure and crumble with startling speed. The family, which had operated with the disciplined efficiency of a corporation under his leadership, quickly devolved into a fractious, paranoid collection of competing factions, each led by capos who believed they were the rightful heir to Sam's throne but lacked his strategic vision, his business acumen, and most importantly, his hard-earned credibility with the powerful commission in New York. From his cell, Sam received fragmented, often contradictory reports of the chaos unfolding on the streets of New Jersey. Unauthorized hits on associates who showed disrespect, brazen and poorly planned robberies that brought unwanted police attention, and bitter disputes over territory that were settled with bullets instead of the quiet, reasoned negotiations he had always preferred. The new generation, men who had come of age during the family's peak prosperity, were impulsive and lacked the patience for the long game. They wanted immediate riches and the flashy status symbols Sam had always forbidden, and they were willing to burn down the entire enterprise to get them. This internal decay was fatally compounded by the relentless legal onslaught that continued even after Sam's incarceration. The treasure trove of evidence from the wiretaps had not been exhausted in a single trial. It became a gift that kept on giving for federal prosecutors, who used the transcripts to secure indictments and convictions against dozens of other family members, effectively decapitating the organization's middle management and severing the crucial lines of communication and command between the imprisoned leadership and the soldiers on the street. The once lucrative rackets began to wither without strong oversight. The construction unions, once a guaranteed source of millions, were infiltrated by federal monitors and rival factions, while the gambling and loan sharking operations were hijacked by ambitious underlings or absorbed by the ever-opportunistic New York families, who saw New Jersey's weakness as a chance to reclaim the territory they had once ceded to Sam. The Gambino and Genovese families, in particular, began to circle like vultures, extracting tribute from the weakened DeCavalcante crews and poaching their most profitable ventures, a humiliating reversal of the sovereignty Sam had fought so hard to establish. The final, symbolic nail in the coffin of the old regime was the rise of informants. The Code of Omerta, which Sam had upheld with such solemnity, became a quaint relic of a bygone era in the face of lengthy prison sentences. Faced with the choice between decades in a maximum security prison or a new life in the witness protection program, one-time loyal soldiers began to break their oaths of silence, providing federal investigators with even more granular details of the family's operations and, crucially, its remaining leadership. These informants confirmed what the FBI already suspected, that the DeCavalcante family was a shadow of its former self, a hollowed-out brand now associated more with failure and incompetence than with fear and power. Sam, in his later years, became a living relic, a ghost haunting the prison system, forced to watch from a distance as his life's work was systematically dismantled, first by the government, and then by his own successors' greed and stupidity. The legend of the plumber was gradually overwritten by the grim reality of a decaying criminal franchise, its influence dwindling to a few city blocks in Elizabeth, its reputation for stability and reliability replaced by a reputation for being leaky, vulnerable, and terminally weak. This steep, irreversible decline from a powerhouse to a punchline was the true tragedy of Sam DeCavalcante's story, a fate he likely considered worse than death itself. The man who had modeled his organization on corporate principles of growth and sustainability had to confront the ultimate business failure. His company had not been beaten by a superior competitor, but had been driven into bankruptcy by terrible internal management and an inability to adapt to a new, more hostile regulatory environment. In this case, the determined and technologically superior forces of the federal government. His imprisonment was not just a personal punishment, it was the catalyst for a chain reaction of collapse that proved no criminal empire, no matter how well built, could survive the loss of its founding visionary and the relentless, documented truth of its own crimes. A lesson that would echo through the underworld for decades to come, signaling the end of the golden age of the traditional mafia and the beginning of its long, slow, and irreversible twilight. The long, slow twilight of the DeCavalcante crime family following the imprisonment of its founder created a power vacuum that festered for years. A toxic inheritance that a succession of lesser men fought over with a short-sighted brutality Sam would have found disgraceful. The first to attempt to fill his considerable shoes was Simone "Sam the Shark" Rizzo, a man whose flashy nickname and equally flashy demeanor represented everything the original Sam had despised. Rizzo's reign was characterized not by quiet consolidation and business growth, but by a series of poorly conceived and violently executed schemes that brought a storm of negative attention from both law enforcement and rival families. Where Sam DeCavalcante had built bridges to New York, Rizzo burned them, authorizing reckless incursions into Gambino-controlled territories and failing to show the proper deference to the Commission, which still viewed New Jersey as its rightful domain. This arrogance culminated in Rizzo's own rapid downfall, as he was indicted and convicted on racketeering charges largely based on the testimony of his own closest associates, who turned government witness to avoid his disastrous leadership. The period that followed was a revolving door of acting bosses and street bosses, figures like John "Johnny Boy" D'Amato and Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo, each more desperate and unstable than the last. The internal culture shifted irrevocably from one of disciplined loyalty to one of pervasive paranoia and betrayal. The old rules, the sacred codes of omerta that Sam had discussed so earnestly on the FBI tapes, were now seen as a sucker's game. The new generation, raised on the instant gratification of the 1980s, viewed the Mafia not as a lifelong commitment to a secret society, but as a fast track to wealth and status, and when that wealth failed to materialize or the status led to a prison cell, their loyalty evaporated. This era was defined not by powerful bosses in quiet offices, but by the wire-wearing informant, a figure that became so common within the DeCavalcante ranks that it became impossible to know who to trust. The most devastating blow came from the very top, when acting boss Vincent Palermo, facing a lengthy prison sentence, made the once unthinkable decision to cooperate with the FBI, becoming the highest-ranking member of the family to ever break his oath. Palermo's testimony was a sledgehammer, detailing decades of murders, extortion plots, and internal betrayals and leading to the indictment of over a dozen of his former comrades, including the man who had once been his friend and boss, John D'Amato. The trials that followed were a circus of accusation and counter-accusation, revealing an organization so thoroughly corrupted from within that it was barely functional. The public image of the Mafia, which Sam had worked so hard to keep in the shadows, was now one of pathetic disarray, a group of middle-aged men squabbling over the remnants of a dying empire, their meetings recorded, their plans known to the authorities before they were even executed. This was the final, humiliating legacy of the once great DeCavalcante family. It had become a cautionary tale, a textbook example of how not to run a criminal organization. The money dried up, the legitimate business fronts were seized by the government, and the fear they once commanded was replaced by pity and ridicule. Younger, more sophisticated criminal enterprises, from Russian mobsters to Mexican cartels, moved into their territories, finding the New Jersey underworld to be soft and undefended. By the dawn of the 21st century, the DeCavalcante family was a ghost, a name on an FBI organizational chart with little real-world power, its remaining members mostly elderly, imprisoned, or living in the shadow of the Witness Protection Program, their stories not of glory and power, but of regret and failure. The mighty fortress Sam had built, with its foundations in unions and construction, had been eroded not by a single catastrophic attack, but by the slow, relentless tide of internal decay, a process that began the very moment its architect was taken away, proving that in the end, the most dangerous enemy the Mafia ever faced was not the FBI, but itself. The profound and irreversible decline of the DeCavalcante crime family into a state of irrelevant, ghostly existence stands in stark, almost poetic contrast to the unexpected and paradoxical form of immortality that its founder, Sam DeCavalcante, eventually achieved, an immortality that arrived not from the barrel of a gun or the control of a union, but from the creative imagination of a television writer who saw in the crumbling remains of the New Jersey underworld the raw material for a cultural phenomenon. In January 1999, HBO premiered a new series titled The Sopranos, a show that would fundamentally alter the landscape of television and reintroduce America to the Mafia, not through the nostalgic lens of The Godfather, but through the gritty, therapeutic, and darkly comedic struggles of a New Jersey mob boss named Tony Soprano. Almost immediately, law enforcement officials, journalists, and those with even a passing knowledge of organized crime recognized the uncanny parallels between the fictional Soprano crime family and the very real, very beleaguered DeCavalcantes. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental, a New Jersey-based family constantly living in the shadow of its more powerful New York counterparts, a boss operating out of a strip club and dealing with the mundane frustrations of suburban life. Storylines ripped directly from the headlines of the family's recent, sordid history, including a boss who was secretly recorded by the FBI in his own backyard. David Chase, the creator of The Sopranos, openly acknowledged that the DeCavalcante family served as a primary source of inspiration, a contemporary, real-world template that was far more relatable and dramatically fertile than the epic, almost mythological struggles of the Corleones. For the few remaining, aging members of the actual DeCavalcante family, this sudden burst of global fame was a bizarre and deeply unsettling experience. On one hand, it granted them a notoriety they could never have achieved on their own. They were no longer just another fading crime family, they were the real-life Sopranos, a label that carried a certain twisted cachet in the underworld. On the other hand, it was the ultimate humiliation, a constant, pop-cultural reminder of their own failure and irrelevance. The show's immense success meant that their every move was now scrutinized through a fictional lens. When a DeCavalcante associate was arrested, newspapers couldn't resist referring to him as a real-life Soprano. The family, which had always operated on the principle of secrecy and anonymity, was now a public spectacle, its most intimate and embarrassing failures. The informants, the incompetent leaders, the internal squabbles, dramatized for the entertainment of millions. For Sam DeCavalcante, who lived out his final years in the obscurity of federal custody, this twist of fate was the final, great irony of his long and complicated life. The man who had prized discretion above all else, who had built his empire in the silent spaces between legitimate enterprises, was now forever linked to one of the most loud, celebrated, and dissected characters in modern fiction. His legacy was no longer defined by his control of the New Jersey waterfront or his diplomatic relations with Carlo Gambino, but by a fictional character's panic attacks and complicated relationship with his mother. The meticulous, business-like criminal empire he had constructed was reduced in the public imagination to a backdrop for a dysfunctional family drama. This cultural appropriation marked the definitive end of the Mafia's power as a real, fearsome force in American society and its transformation into a source of entertainment and nostalgia. The real violence and corruption was sanitized and repackaged as compelling narrative, and the terrifying figure of the mob boss was humanized, psychoanalyzed, and ultimately rendered harmless. The DeCavalcante family, in its death throes, had inadvertently given birth to its own myth, but it was a myth that completely overshadowed and ultimately erased the gritty reality of its existence. The story of Sam the Plumber was no longer a cautionary tale about crime and punishment. It was a footnote in the production notes of a television show, a piece of historical trivia for dedicated fans. The empire of fear he built had been conquered not by the FBI, but by HBO, and his downfall was now permanently framed not by the cold, hard facts of a federal indictment, but by the haunting final notes of Don't Stop Believin' in a diner in Jersey. In the end, the most lasting and widely known chapter of the DeCavalcante story is the one they never actually lived, a fictionalized eulogy for a family that had already long since ceased to matter, ensuring that Sam DeCavalcante would be remembered, but for all the wrong reasons, his true history forever obscured by the brilliant, long shadow of the fictional monster he helped to create. The complex and often contradictory legacy of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante extends far beyond the sensationalized fiction his life inspired, forcing a necessary and sobering reassessment of his true impact on the American criminal landscape and the fleeting nature of power built on a foundation of fear and corruption. To view him merely as the real-life template for a television character is to overlook the profound, and often darkly impressive, achievements of his criminal career and the cautionary lessons embedded in his ultimate failure. Sam was a pioneer, a visionary in his own ruthless way, who demonstrated that with enough intelligence, patience, and strategic diplomacy, it was possible to carve out a sovereign criminal state within the borders of the United States, even in the daunting shadow of the 5 legendary families of New York. His reign represents a critical, transitional chapter in the history of organized crime, the moment the old-world Sicilian traditions of the mustache Pete's collided with the modern American corporate ethos, and Sam was one of its most adept synthesizers. He understood that the future of the Mafia lay not in bloody street corner battles for prestige, but in the quiet, systematic infiltration of legitimate industries, the corruption of labor unions, and the manipulation of political and economic systems on a scale that made traditional law enforcement tactics obsolete. For nearly 2 decades, he perfected this model, operating with a discretion that made him seem more like a reclusive business magnate than a traditional mob boss, his power radiating not from overt violence but from the unspoken understanding that he controlled the levers of entire sectors of New Jersey's economy. His ability to negotiate with figures like Carlo Gambino and Tommy Luchis as a respected peer, not a subordinate, was a monumental achievement that has never been replicated by a New Jersey boss, a testament to his unique blend of personal charisma, financial acumen, and unwavering resolve. Yet, the very source of his strength also contained the seeds of his destruction. His corporate approach, which relied on stability, predictability, and long-term planning, was ultimately incompatible with the inherently volatile and treacherous world he inhabited, a world populated by greedy, impulsive, and disloyal men who could not be managed like employees on an organizational chart. The wiretaps that destroyed him were not just a technological defeat, they were the ultimate exposure of this fundamental flaw, revealing the immense, exhausting effort required to maintain a facade of order over a chaotic and brutal enterprise. The downfall of his organization after his imprisonment is the final and most telling part of his story, proving that his empire was a personal creation, too dependent on his unique skills and temperament to be sustainable. It was not a dynasty that could be passed down, but a one-man show that collapsed when the star left the stage. The subsequent decades of infighting, incompetence, and mass betrayal by informants like Vincent Palermo serve as a grim postscript, illustrating that without a leader of Sam's caliber, the sophisticated corporation swiftly devolved into a chaotic and self-cannibalizing gang. His legacy, therefore, is a double-edged sword. He was both the architect of New Jersey's most powerful independent crime family and the unwitting architect of its most humiliating demise. The cultural appropriation of his story by the Sopranos completes this cycle, transforming the hard, cold facts of his criminal enterprise into a source of entertainment and psychological drama, effectively neutering the true terror and corruption he represented. The real Sam DeCavalcante was not Tony Soprano. He was smarter, more disciplined, and in many ways, more dangerous because his violence was calculated and his ambitions were grander. To remember him only through that fictional prism is to do a historical disservice, to forget the very real damage inflicted on communities, unions, and businesses by the organization he led. The true lesson of his life is not found in a television script, but in the silent, empty spaces he left behind, the legitimate businesses that were crushed, the pension funds that were looted, and the lives that were ruined or ended to serve his ambition. His story is a powerful reminder that all empires, whether legitimate or criminal, are fragile constructs, and that power, when built on sand, cannot withstand the tides of time, technology, and human fallibility. Sam DeCavalcante's life remains a compelling, darkly fascinating chapter in American history, not because it inspired a show, but because it serves as a permanent monument to the limits of ill-gotten power and the inescapable reality that no criminal, no matter how clever or cautious, can ever truly outrun the consequences of their own actions. The enduring fascination with the life and legacy of Sam DeCavalcante, long after the guns have fallen silent and the courtrooms have emptied, speaks to a deeper, more universal human obsession with the nature of power, the illusion of order, and the inevitable tragedy that awaits those who build their kingdoms in the shadows. His story has transcended the gritty details of racketeering and murder to become a modern parable, a complex moral puzzle that continues to provoke discussion and analysis among historians, true crime enthusiasts, and cultural critics alike. At its heart, the saga of the Plumber forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the American dream itself, and the dark, twisted paths some are willing to take to achieve it. Sam was, in his own perverse way, a quintessential American entrepreneur, an immigrant son who used his wits, ambition, and relentless drive to build an empire from nothing, mirroring the journeys of legitimate industrialists and capitalists of his era, but simply choosing a route that existed outside the bounds of law and morality. His focus on business over brutality, his insistence on a legitimate public front, and his desire for stability and growth were all hallmarks of a corporate CEO, reflecting the very values the country purported to celebrate. Yet they were deployed in the service of a criminal enterprise that undermined the foundations of a fair society. This stark contradiction is what makes his story so perpetually compelling. He was not a monster who operated outside the understanding of ordinary people, but a man whose ambitions and methods were recognizably human, even if his actions were monstrous. We can understand his desire for respect, his frustration with incompetent subordinates, his pride in his organization, and his fear of losing it all, emotions vividly captured on the FBI tapes. and this very understanding creates a disquieting sense of identification that a more sensationalized, one-dimensional villain could never achieve. His downfall, meticulously documented by his own words, serves as a slow-motion study of the collapse of a worldview, a demonstration that the codes of honor and loyalty he so often cited were ultimately powerless against the combined forces of modern technology, relentless law enforcement, and the inherent greed and fear of the people around him. The wiretaps did not just provide evidence, they provided a philosophical rebuttal to the entire Mafia mythos, revealing the organization not as a noble secret society but as a collection of fallible, anxious, and often petty men engaged in sordid criminality. The subsequent fictionalization of his world in The Sopranos further cemented this demystification, but it also ensured that the core questions of his life would be debated for generations. Was he a tragic figure, a brilliant man whose talents, if applied legitimately, could have achieved greatness? Or was he simply a more sophisticated thug whose justifications for his crimes were merely the self-serving delusions of a criminal mind? The answer, much like the man himself, is shrouded in layers of contradiction. He was both a builder and a destroyer, a traditionalist and a modernizer, a respected leader and a convicted felon. His legacy is not a single lesson, but a series of warnings, about the corrupting influence of absolute power, the fragility of institutions built on fear, and the haunting truth that in the digital age, there are no more secrets, and the walls themselves will testify against you. The quiet, unassuming man who once directed a criminal empire from a plumbing supply office in Kenilworth ultimately became a symbol of something much larger than himself. The end of an era, the blurring of line between reality and fiction, and a permanent cautionary tale written not in ink, but in the static hiss of a federal surveillance tape, a ghostly whisper from the past reminding us that no one, not even the most powerful and careful of men, can ever truly control their own story. The final years of Sam DeCavalcante's life, spent within the stark and unforgiving confines of the federal prison system, were profound and relentless reckoning, a quiet epilogue to an existence defined by noise, power, and control. Stripped of the authority he had so meticulously cultivated, separated from the intricate web of business and personal relationships that had formed the fabric of his identity, the once powerful boss was reduced to a number, a face in a crowd of convicted men, his legendary status meaning little within the monotonous and oppressive routine of incarceration. This period was not marked by the dramatic confrontations or cunning manipulations of his prime, but by a slow, grinding introspection, a forced confrontation with the ultimate consequences of the path he had chosen decades earlier on the streets of Elizabeth. He lived long enough to witness the complete and utter disintegration of his life's work, receiving fragmented, often humiliating news of his family's descent into farce, the rise of incompetent and flashy successors, the bitter internal wars that turned brother against brother, and the ultimate, unforgivable sin within his world, the mass defection of his soldiers to become government informants, their testimony finishing the job the wiretaps had started. The knowledge that men he had broken bread with, whose families he had helped, were now freely discussing the secrets of his organization with FBI agents, must have been a psychological torment far greater than any physical deprivation of prison life. It was the final, brutal invalidation of the code of omerta he had held as sacred, the ultimate proof that the world he believed in, the world of honor and silence, had never truly existed, or had at the very least died with his generation. His name, once spoken in whispers of fear and respect, was now being bartered by traitors for reduced sentences, his legacy becoming a currency of betrayal. Compounding this internal anguish was the bizarre cultural phenomenon unfolding in the outside world, the global sensation of The Sopranos, which took the crumbling ruins of his New Jersey underworld and repackaged it as award-winning entertainment. He would have heard of it, through smuggled newspapers or whispered conversations in the prison yard, the surreal reality that a fictionalized, therapeutic version of his life was being devoured by millions, that the quiet, serious business of building a criminal empire was now the subject of water-cooler discussions and critical theory. The man who had operated in the shadows to avoid notoriety was now the indirect inspiration for one of the most famous characters on television, a final, ironic twist of the knife that ensured his anonymity was forever lost, yet his true story was forever obscured. In his final days, Sam DeCavalcante became a living ghost, a relic from a bygone era occupying a small, sterile cell, his mind likely drifting back through the decades to the ambitious young man in Sicily, the rising star in Elizabeth, the powerful boss negotiating with legends, and the trapped defendant listening to his own voice condemn him in a courtroom. The rise, the reign, and the fall were now complete, a closed loop of ambition, power, and consequence. His death in 1997, while still in custody, was not a dramatic event but a quiet passing, a final exit from a stage he had long since been forced to leave. There was no massive underworld funeral, no procession of black limousines filled with grieving capos. The era of such displays was over, and the family that would have organized it was in shambles. He was buried, and with him, the last authentic connection to the founding vision of the DeCavalcante crime family was extinguished. What remained was a hollow shell of an organization, a name kept on life support by the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, and a legend that had been permanently, and perhaps unfairly, fused with fiction. The story of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante ends not with a bang, but with the silent, echoing emptiness of a prison cell, a powerful reminder that the pursuit of power through corruption and violence is a self-canceling endeavor, a path that ultimately leads not to glory, but to a profound and inescapable solitude, where the only thing left to rule over is the memory of what was, and the bitter understanding of what could have been. The story of Sam DeCavalcante does not conclude with his physical death or the administrative dissolution of his crime family on an FBI flowchart. Rather, it continues as a persistent and haunting echo in the halls of American justice, a foundational case study that permanently altered the tactics and tools used to combat organized crime, leaving a legacy far more impactful than any single criminal enterprise could ever hope to achieve. The legal and investigative strategies pioneered and perfected during the multi-year investigation into the DeCavalcante family became the new gold standard for federal law enforcement, a procedural blueprint that would be used to systematically dismantle every major mafia family in the United States in the decades that followed. The decision to prioritize electronic surveillance over traditional undercover work or reliance on informants was a revolutionary shift, one that acknowledged the impenetrable wall of omerta could be bypassed entirely by listening to the bosses themselves. The thousands of hours of transcripts from the Kenilworth office did not just provide evidence for convictions, they provided a comprehensive education in the language, structure, and psychology of La Cosa Nostra, a masterclass that taught agents and prosecutors how these men thought, how they communicated in code, how they resolved disputes, and where their true vulnerabilities lay. This intelligence was instrumental in building the landmark Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, cases that would follow, as the patterns of criminal enterprise so clearly documented in Sam's own words established the necessary templates for proving the continuous criminal conspiracy required by the statute. The DeCavalcante investigation was the proving ground, the real-world laboratory where the theories of modern anti-racketeering law were tested and validated with devastating effect. Furthermore, the psychological warfare component of the operation, allowing the family to feel the increasing pressure, to let the paranoia fester, and to use their own words against them in court, became a core tenet of federal strategy, demonstrating that dismantling a criminal organization was as much about breaking its spirit as it was about arresting its members. The sight of a calm, collected, and respected boss like Sam DeCavalcante being visibly unnerved and ultimately defeated by the relentless playback of his own private conversations sent a shockwave through the entire underworld, proving that no one was beyond the reach of this new form of investigation. The subsequent collapse of the family into a nest of informants was a direct and predictable outcome of this strategy, a lesson the FBI would apply with even greater success against the more powerful families in New York, using the threat of RICO sentences to turn made men into cooperating witnesses at an unprecedented rate. In this sense, Sam DeCavalcante's greatest, albeit unintentional, contribution was to serve as the prototype for the downfall of the American Mafia itself. The methods that trapped him were refined and scaled, leading directly to the convictions of the heads of all 5 families in the Mafia Commission trial of the mid-1980s and the subsequent decline of the organization's national power. His story, therefore, is a critical pivot point in the history of 20th century crime, marking the moment the tide definitively turned in favor of the government. The quiet, patient work of the agents who transcribed his conversations did more to cripple organized crime than any single undercover operation or gangland war ever could. The legacy of the plumber is thus forever entwined with the legacy of the FBI's Organized Crime Division. His rise provided the opportunity, and his fall provided the blueprint. The empire he built with such care and calculation ultimately became the most valuable training tool his enemies ever possessed. A bitter irony that would likely have been the most painful revelation of all for the pragmatic businessman, to know that his life's work, in its failure, had become the indispensable guidebook for the destruction of his entire world. The profound and often unsettling cultural resonance of Sam DeCavalcante's story, particularly its fictional reimagining in The Sopranos, invites a deeper examination of why this specific chapter of criminal history continues to captivate the public imagination long after the direct participants have passed from the scene. revealing as much about our own societal fascinations and anxieties as it does about the man himself. Our collective obsession is not merely with the violence or the illicit riches, but with the complex and deeply human contradictions that his life embodied, the stark juxtaposition of the mundane and the monstrous that forces us to question the very nature of evil and the fragile boundaries of our own morality. Sam was not a comic book villain. He was a father, a businessman, a community figure who paid his taxes and worried about his plumbing supply inventory, while simultaneously presiding over a vast network of extortion, corruption, and murder. This dissonance is the core of his enduring appeal, the uncomfortable truth that darkness does not always announce itself with a snarl, but can reside within the calm, reasoned demeanor of a man discussing profit margins. The Sopranos tap directly into this nerve, magnifying these contradictions for dramatic effect, but the raw material was provided by the real, wiretapped life of Sam DeCavalcante, a man who could, in one recorded conversation, express genuine concern for an associate's sick child and in the next, coldly authorize the execution of another associate for a business transgression. This duality challenges our simplistic notions of good and evil, presenting a figure who is neither a hero nor a purely repellent monster, but a disturbingly recognizable human being who made a series of catastrophic moral choices. Furthermore, his story serves as a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties of the American middle class, the creeping fear that the system is rigged, that success is often predicated on compromise, and that the line between legitimate ambition and criminal enterprise can be perilously thin. Tony Soprano's struggles in the suburbs, his problematic family, his sense of entitlement, his therapy sessions, were a direct narrative descendant of the real tensions in Sam's world, the constant juggling of a public, respectable life with a brutal, hidden one. We watch, and we recognize, on some level, the performance required to navigate our own professional and social worlds, the hidden compromises and silent betrayals, albeit on a vastly different and non-violent scale. The boss, in this modern interpretation, becomes a grotesque amplification of the everyday corporate boss, the suburban father, the man struggling to preserve his legacy in a world that no longer values the old ways. Sam DeCavalcante's life provides the historical weight behind this fiction, the proof that these dramatic tensions were not entirely invented, but were rooted in the real struggles of a real man trying to manage his own dysfunctional, lethal corporation. His ultimate failure, his being hoisted by the petard of his own words, also satisfies a deep-seated societal need for moral order, a reassurance that no matter how powerful or clever one becomes, justice, in some form, will ultimately prevail. We are fascinated by the rise, but we are comforted by the fall. The thousands of hours of FBI tapes provide the incontrovertible evidence of that fall, a modern-day Greek tragedy where the hero's fatal flaw is his own hubris, captured not by a chorus, but by a hidden microphone. In the end, the ongoing fascination with Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante is a testament to the power of a story that is both uniquely American and universally human, a saga of ambition, identity, and the inescapable consequences of our actions, a chilling reminder that the most compelling stories are not those of pure fiction, but those woven from the complex, contradictory, and often unsettling threads of truth. The meticulous and patient strategy employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the DeCavalcante case represents a watershed moment in the annals of American jurisprudence, a paradigm shift from reactive policing to proactive, intelligence-driven dismantlement of entire criminal enterprises, a methodology that would ultimately prove more devastating to the foundations of organized crime than any single conviction or gangland war. This was not a case built on a lucky break or a turncoat witness, though those would later emerge. It was a campaign of intellectual and technological superiority, a long game played with relentless precision against an enemy that believed itself insulated by secrecy and fear. The agents assigned to the case, whose names remain largely in the shadows, displayed a level of discipline and foresight that mirrored Sam DeCavalcante's own patient rise to power, understanding that to defeat a corporate-style criminal entity, they had to think like corporate raiders, studying the business model, identifying the key assets and vulnerabilities, and executing a plan to force a hostile takeover by the state. The initial decision to plant the listening device was an act of profound insight, a recognition that the boss's office was not just a place where crimes were planned, but the central nervous system of the entire organization, the place where its culture, its conflicts, and its very soul were laid bare. For the years that followed, a rotating team of agents sat in sterile monitoring rooms, wearing headphones for 8-hour shifts, listening to the mundane and the monstrous, meticulously transcribing every slurred word, every veiled threat, every sigh of frustration, transforming casual conversation into a lexicon of conspiracy. This was grueling, often tedious work, requiring not only linguistic skill to decipher the thick accents and coded language, but also a deep psychological fortitude to immerse oneself daily in a world of such moral ambiguity and casual violence without becoming desensitized or losing sight of the ultimate goal. The transcripts they produced are not just legal documents, they are ethnographic field notes, a priceless archive that captured the subculture of the American Mafia at its operational peak, providing an unfiltered record of its values, its hierarchies, and its internal logic. The prosecutors who later wielded this evidence were like archaeologists given a complete Rosetta Stone. They could now interpret every fragment of other evidence, a cryptic phone call, a suspicious financial transaction, a body found in a swamp, within the full context of the boss's own explanations and orders. This allowed them to build a case that was not a collection of discrete, provable crimes, but a holistic narrative of a continuing criminal enterprise, the very definition of a RICO violation. The true masterstroke, however, was in the timing and the psychological deployment of this evidence. The FBI did not swoop in immediately after recording a single damning conversation. They waited, allowing the web of self-incrimination to grow thicker and more entangled, patiently mapping the entire network of the family before making their move. When the indictments finally came, they were not a surprise attack but a revealed checkmate, the public unveiling of a game that had already been won. The use of the transcripts in court was not merely about proving guilt. It was about demonstrating omniscience, about showing every member of the organization, from the boss down to the lowest soldier, that their most private sanctum had been violated, that their own words were now the most potent weapons against them. This shattered the myth of their invulnerability and created the climate of paranoia and betrayal that led to the cascade of informants that would plague the family for the next 2 decades. The DeCavalcante investigation, therefore, stands as a monument to a new kind of warfare against organized crime, one fought with wires and warrants instead of bullets, with patience instead of bravado, and with the unassailable power of the truth, spoken in the defendant's own voices. It was a victory not of force, but of intellect, a testament to the idea that the most effective way to defeat a shadow empire is to simply turn on the lights and let its rulers see the walls closing in, recorded for posterity and for the relentless machinery of justice. The ultimate dismantling of the DeCavalcante crime family, when viewed not as a singular event but as a protracted process of erosion, serves as the definitive case study in the inherent fragility of criminal empires, revealing that their greatest vulnerability lies not in external pressure but in the corrosive internal dynamics that are unleashed the moment the leader's absolute authority is compromised. The long, slow decline that followed Sam's incarceration is a textbook example of institutional collapse, mirroring the fate of any autocratic corporation that loses its visionary CEO without a clear succession plan or a corporate culture robust enough to survive the transition. The power vacuum Sam left behind was not a clean slate but a toxic inheritance, a throne room stained with the blood of old betrayals and surrounded by hungry, lesser men who had witnessed the once omnipotent boss humbled by the law. The initial struggles for control between figures like Simone Rizzo and others were not merely personal squabbles. They were symptomatic of a fundamental breakdown in the governance structure of the family. The respect for the office of the boss, which Sam had cultivated through a combination of earned authority and feared consequence, evaporated, replaced by a naked ambition that recognized no higher authority than individual greed. This period of internecine warfare, of crews turning against each other and unauthorized hits becoming commonplace, was the first and most critical phase of the collapse, as it systematically destroyed the internal trust and operational discipline that are the lifeblood of any secretive organization. Without a central, respected authority to mediate disputes, every minor grievance festered into a potential war, and every business decision became a zero-sum game where cooperation was seen as weakness. This internal chaos created a positive feedback loop of failure. The more chaotic and violent the family became, the more attention it drew from law enforcement, which led to more arrests, which created more pressure on those still free, which in turn made them more desperate and more likely to make reckless mistakes or, crucially, to consider cooperation with the government. The rise of the informant culture within the DeCavalcante ranks was not an anomaly but the inevitable result of this deteriorating environment. The Code of Omerta, which Sam had so fiercely believed in, is ultimately a social contract. It functions only as long as the organization can provide protection, profit, and a sense of honorable purpose. When the family could no longer guarantee safety from its own internal betrayals, when its profit streams dwindled due to incompetent management and constant police scrutiny, and when its honor was revealed to be a hollow fiction by the boss's own wiretapped pragmatism, the social contract was voided. For a soldier facing 40 years in prison, loyalty to a disintegrating organization led by a man he no longer respected offered no upside. turning government witness became a rational, if despised, business decision. The cooperation of acting boss Vincent Palermo was not just another indictment. It was the symbolic death knell, the ultimate proof that the family was now cannibalizing itself from the very top. His testimony did more than just send men to prison. It irrevocably poisoned the well, ensuring that no one could ever trust the word of their boss again. This internal rot, more than any external force, is what reduced the DeCavalcante family to a ghost. The money from the unions and construction rackets dried up not because the FBI seized it all, but because the organization became too unstable and unreliable to effectively manage such complex criminal enterprises. Rival families, seeing the weakness, moved in to pick apart the carcass, taking over their territories and poaching their remaining earners. By the early 2000s, what remained was not a crime family in any meaningful sense, but a loosely affiliated gang of aging, nostalgic wise guys and a few young, unimpressive thugs, their operations reduced to small-time scams and bragging about a history they had no part in creating. The fall of the House of DeCavalcante is, therefore, the most important lesson of Sam's story, that a criminal empire, no matter how wealthy or feared, is a fragile ecosystem. It can survive external attacks, but it cannot survive the loss of its central sun, the corruption of its core principles, and the subsequent descent into a chaos where every man becomes his own king, and every kingdom is the size of a prison cell. The story of Sam DeCavalcante, when stripped of its cinematic allure and viewed through the cold, hard lens of historical consequence, resolves into a profoundly simple yet devastatingly powerful equation, a universal law of human endeavor that applies to both the legitimate boardroom and the illicit backroom. That an empire built on a foundation of fear is inherently unsustainable, destined to collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions long before any external force can ever hope to topple it. Sam's genius was in his understanding of corporate structure and long-term strategic planning, but his fatal flaw was his belief that he could impose the orderly principles of a publicly traded company onto a venture whose very existence depended on violence, secrecy, and the perpetual threat of betrayal. For a time, the sheer force of his personality and intellect made this seem possible. He was the benevolent dictator, the CEO who could command loyalty through a combination of shared profit and unspoken dread, the living embodiment of the system's stability. But the moment he was removed, the delicate illusion shattered, revealing the organization for what it always was. Not a loyal workforce, but a coalition of self-interested predators held in check only by the presence of a larger, more powerful predator. The subsequent power struggle was not a deviation from the plan. It was the natural state of the system reasserting itself in the absence of the one man who had temporarily suppressed it. The greed, the paranoia, the reckless ambition that characterized the reigns of his successors were not new forces. They were the very same forces that Sam had skillfully manipulated and channeled for his own purposes, now unleashed without a master to direct them. This internal decay was exponentially accelerated by the technological and legal revolution that Sam himself had inadvertently helped to pioneer. The wiretaps did not just provide evidence, they provided a blueprint for the family's own self-destruction. By revealing the boss's private frustrations, his vulnerabilities, and his very human anxieties, the tapes demystified the office of the boss, stripping it of the godlike authority that is essential for maintaining control over volatile and ambitious men. When the soldiers and capos could read, in black and white, their boss worrying about money or complaining about the incompetence of his own crew, the aura of invincibility evaporated. The transcripts became a psychological weapon that the FBI wielded with devastating effect, but it was a weapon forged in the family's own foundry, from the ore of their own unguarded conversations. This created a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. The pressure from the law intensified the internal strife, and the internal strife produced more evidence and more informants, which in turn intensified the pressure from the law. The family was caught in a feedback loop of its own creation, a death spiral where every attempted solution only deepened the crisis. The final, humiliating chapter, with high-ranking bosses like Vincent Palermo becoming cooperating witnesses, was the logical endpoint of this process, the ultimate triumph of individual survival over collective loyalty. In the end, the DeCavalcante crime family was not defeated by the FBI. It was defeated by its own inherent nature. The Bureau simply provided the conditions, the pressure, the transparency, the undeniable proof, for that nature to express itself in its most self-destructive form. The empire fell not because its walls were stormed, but because the mortar holding those walls together, a mixture of fear, respect, and perceived mutual interest, proved to be water-soluble, dissolving completely when the relentless rain of legal scrutiny began to fall. Sam DeCavalcante's legacy, therefore, is not just the story of a man who rose and fell. It is a timeless lesson in the limits of power that is derived from coercion. It demonstrates that an organization cannot be built to last when its primary binding agent is the fear of its leader. For when that leader is gone, all that remains is the fear, now directionless and toxic, turning inward until it consumes the very structure it was meant to support. The quiet, unassuming plumber from Kenilworth built a complex and intricate machine, but he failed to understand that the most critical component, the one he could never replace, was himself, and without that single, irreplaceable part, the entire magnificent, terrible apparatus was doomed to grind itself into dust. The cultural and historical footprint of Sam DeCavalcante, therefore, exists in a state of perpetual duality, a split image where one side reflects the gritty, unromantic reality of a criminal businessman brought low by his own words, and the other reflects the global phenomenon of a television show that used his life as a springboard into the American subconscious, creating a legacy that is simultaneously profound and perpetually misunderstood. To truly assess his impact, one must hold these two images in mind at once. The historical Sam, a man of quiet calculation and ruthless efficiency whose empire crumbled from within, and the cultural Sam, the spectral inspiration for a fictional universe that explored themes of identity, family, and existential dread in a way that resonated with millions who had never heard of the real DeCavalcante crime family. This bifurcation is the final, and perhaps most fascinating, chapter of his story. The historical record, cemented by the FBI wiretaps, paints a picture of a specific type of American criminal, one who represented the peak of a certain kind of organized crime, corporate, integrated, and discreet. His significance lies in his demonstration of the Mafia's potential to evolve into a truly sophisticated, quasi-legitimate economic force, a potential that was ultimately extinguished not by a return to old-fashioned gangsterism, but by the even more sophisticated tools of the modern state. He is a crucial figure for historians and criminologists, a case study in the limits of criminal ambition and the transformative power of electronic surveillance. Yet, for the vast majority of the world, this nuanced historical figure is completely obscured by the long shadow of Tony Soprano. The cultural legacy, channeled through David Chase's masterpiece, is both a blessing and a curse for the memory of the real man. It is a blessing because it ensures his name, or at least the outline of his story, will be remembered and discussed for generations, granting him a form of immortality that his own criminal achievements could never provide. But it is a curse because it has permanently fictionalized him, reducing the complex, careful, and genuinely powerful boss to a mere footnote in the creation of a fictional character whose struggles were often more domestic and psychological than they were criminal and strategic. The real Sam DeCavalcante was not in therapy. He was the therapist for his entire organization, the calm center resolving disputes and managing egos. The real Sam did not have panic attacks over ducks in his pool. He had legitimate, calculated anxieties about federal indictments and betrayals from within. The conflation of the two has created a distorted popular understanding, one where the gritty reality of his criminal enterprise is softened by the relatable, often darkly comic, humanity of his fictional counterpart. This blending of fact and fiction has had the paradoxical effect of both immortalizing and diminishing him in the same instant. He is remembered, but for the wrong reasons. His true legacy, the business model, the diplomatic finesse, the catastrophic failure caused by technological progress, is a subject for specialized books and academic papers. His pop culture legacy, the connection to a hit TV show, is the subject of barroom trivia and internet forums. The man who so valued control and discretion ultimately lost all control over his own narrative, his life story becoming a piece of intellectual property to be adapted, reinterpreted, and fictionalized for mass consumption. The final irony of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante's life is that the most enduring pipe he ever laid was not one of copper and lead, carrying water through the walls of New Jersey homes, but a narrative one, carrying his story, however inaccurately, into the living rooms of the world, a flow of information and entertainment that he himself could never hope to control, dam, or divert, proving once and for all that while a man can build an empire in the shadows, his legacy will always be defined in the light, and often by strangers with their own stories to tell. The enduring question that lingers long after the final chapter of Sam DeCavalcante's life has been written is not whether he was a good man or a bad man. The historical record of his crimes renders that moral calculation starkly simple, but rather what his unique journey reveals about the very nature of the American experience, the seductive and often corrupting allure of the self-made myth, and the hidden costs of ambition when pursued outside the boundaries of a society's laws. In many ways, Sam was the dark doppelganger of the post-war American success story, a figure who embraced the core tenets of capitalism, entrepreneurship, and relentless drive for expansion, but who applied them to a marketplace that existed in the shadows, a twisted reflection of the legitimate economic boom transforming the nation. His rise from immigrant son to powerful, respected leader mirrors the archetypal narrative of upward mobility. Yet his chosen path ensured that his version of the American dream was built on a foundation of fear, exploitation, and violence, a corrupted blueprint that could only result in a structurally unsound future. This fundamental contradiction forces a re-examination of the stories we tell ourselves about success and power, challenging the comforting notion that virtue is always rewarded and vice is always punished in the clear-cut manner of a Hollywood screenplay. Sam's intelligence, his discipline, and his strategic brilliance were real and, in a different context, could have been the engines of legitimate greatness. Instead, they became the tools for building a criminal monopoly, a testament to the fact that human talent is morally neutral and can be harnessed for profoundly destructive ends just as easily as for constructive ones. His life stands as a permanent caution against the romanticization of the outlaw, a grim reminder that the real-world consequences of such a path are not the stylish, bloodless affairs of cinema, but a sordid tapestry of ruined lives, corrupted institutions, and a legacy of trauma that echoes through generations. The unions he infiltrated were left weaker and more cynical. The businesses he extorted were forced to operate in a climate of fear, and the families of those he ordered killed were left with a void that could never be filled. The true cost of the DeCavalcante empire cannot be measured in the millions of dollars he accumulated, but in this diffuse and lasting damage inflicted upon the social and economic fabric of New Jersey. Furthermore, his story is a powerful allegory for the inevitable clash between tradition and modernity. Sam was, in a sense, the last of a certain kind of traditional boss, a man who believed in the old codes even as he modernized the business, and his downfall was orchestrated by the most modern of tools, electronic surveillance and federal statutes like RICO. He was a master of a world that was rapidly becoming obsolete, a chess player of great skill who suddenly found the game had changed to one played with computers he did not understand. The wiretaps were not just a legal tactic, they were the embodiment of a new era, one where privacy could be vaporized and the most secretive of societies could be laid bare by a hidden microphone. His inability to comprehend or counter this new threat highlights the ultimate fragility of any system, criminal or legitimate, that fails to adapt to technological and legal evolution. In the end, the saga of Sam DeCavalcante is a multifaceted prism through which we can view some of the most enduring themes of the human condition: the corrupting nature of power, the tension between individual ambition and collective good, the tragic gap between potential and outcome, and the relentless, unforgiving march of time and progress that eventually renders even the most powerful figures into relics of a bygone age. His life demands that we look beyond the easy labels of gangster or crime boss and confront the more uncomfortable reality of a complex, talented, and fatally flawed man who made a series of choices that sealed his fate and the fate of the organization he built, leaving behind a story that is not just a thrilling true crime narrative, but a somber and timeless lesson on the price of power and the inescapable reach of justice. However delayed it may be, the meticulous and patient documentation of Sam DeCavalcante's criminal enterprise, captured in the stark, unadorned prose of the FBI wiretap transcripts, provides an unparalleled and sobering archive, a raw and unfiltered narrative that stands in stark opposition to the romanticized mythology that has long shrouded the American Mafia in a fog of glamorous fiction. These transcripts, more than any history book or biographical account, serve as the ultimate deconstruction of the mobster archetype, systematically dismantling the popular image of the honorable, loyal, and noble gangster perpetuated by decades of cinema and television. The man who speaks through these pages is not a Vito Corleone, a figure of gravitas and moral complexity, but a harried, anxious, and often frustrated middle manager, a CEO of a deeply dysfunctional corporation whose primary concerns are cash flow, personnel problems, and competitive pressures. The conversations are littered not with poetic soliloquies on honor and family, but with the grindingly mundane details of criminal administration. Complaints about a soldier who is not kicking up enough money, worries about a rival crew moving in on a lucrative gambling operation, tedious debates over the division of profits from a construction site shakedown, and constant, grating anxiety about the looming presence of law enforcement. This is the true banality of evil, not in the dramatic order of a hit, but in the endless, soul-crushing paperwork of corruption, the day-in, day-out effort required to maintain a system built on fear. The transcripts reveal the Mafia not as a secret society of knights upholding a sacred code, but as a grubby, parasitic business, populated by men who are, for the most part, petty, greedy, suspicious, and startlingly ordinary. The myth of omerta is exploded on page after page, not by grand betrayals, but by the constant, low-level gossip, the backbiting, and the casual disrespect the captains and soldiers often show for one another when speaking to the boss. The profound disconnect between the lofty ideals Sam sometimes espoused, the importance of respect, the sanctity of one's word, and the sordid reality of his daily operations creates a powerful sense of cognitive dissonance, laying bare the immense hypocrisy that was necessary to sustain the entire criminal edifice. He could lecture a made man about the importance of discipline and then, in the next breath, coolly discuss the need to have another man killed for being a liability or for showing disrespect. This is not the world of mythic codes and tragic honor. It is the world of a predatory enterprise, where violence is a tool for problem-solving and loyalty is a currency that is spent the moment it becomes inconvenient. The sheer volume of the transcripts, the thousands of hours of conversation about money, power, and survival, creates a claustrophobic effect, pulling the reader into the windowless, smoke-filled room where these men plotted their schemes and revealed their petty, human frailties. There are no heroes in this story, only perpetrators and victims, and the transcripts ensure that the perpetrators are never allowed to hide behind a veil of romance or mystery. They are captured in their own words, forever frozen in time, their legacy not one of glory or power, but one of criminal conspiracy, their names etched not on a monument, but on a federal docket sheet. The historical value of this archive is immeasurable, for it provides the definitive, primary source rebuttal to a century of mob mythology, a gift from the FBI to future historians that ensures the true, unvarnished, and deeply unglamorous reality of La Cosa Nostra will never be completely forgotten, no matter how many fictionalized versions are produced for our entertainment. It is the ultimate demystification, a relentless and unforgiving spotlight shone into the darkest corners of Sam DeCavalcante's world, revealing not the powerful, confident boss of legend, but a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, slowly realizing that the walls are closing in, and that his own voice, meticulously recorded by his enemies, is the very thing that will seal his fate. The final, inescapable conclusion drawn from the epic rise and catastrophic fall of Sam DeCavalcante is that his entire life's work constituted a magnificent and tragic paradox, a grand-scale exercise in futility where every success sowed the seeds of its own destruction and every measure taken to ensure longevity only accelerated the inevitable collapse. He was a man who dedicated his immense intellect and relentless energy to building an organization designed for permanence, a criminal dynasty that would outlive him and carry his name forward with power and respect. Yet the very nature of the enterprise he chose made that dream an impossibility from the very beginning. The foundation of his empire was not concrete and steel, but a volatile mixture of human greed, fear, and ambition, materials that are inherently unstable and impossible to control indefinitely. His greatest strength, his corporate mindset and his ability to project an image of calm, legitimate business authority, became his greatest vulnerability, as it attracted the focused, methodical attention of a federal government that had learned to fight corruption not with street-level busts, but with the same kind of long-term, strategic thinking he himself employed. The wiretaps were the physical manifestation of this paradox. His own office, the sanctum of his power, was transformed into the primary engine of his downfall, his words of command and counsel becoming the nails in his own coffin. The meticulous records he kept, the structured hierarchy he implemented, the very efficiency of his criminal corporation, all the elements he put in place to create stability and ensure smooth operation, were the same elements that made it so vulnerable to a RICO prosecution, which required proof of an ongoing, structured criminal enterprise. He had, in effect, built the perfect case for the prosecution with every business decision he made. Furthermore, the legacy he so desperately wanted to leave was systematically dismantled not by a foreign invader, but by the very men he had raised and trusted, the successors whose weakness and short-sightedness proved that the qualities of leadership he possessed were unique to him and could not be institutionalized or passed down. The code of honor he preached so fervently was revealed to be a hollow shell, a convenient fiction that collapsed the moment the pressure became too great, proving that loyalty purchased with fear and profit is a conditional loyalty, one that evaporates when the fear is redirected and the profits dry up. Even his cultural legacy was stolen from him, his life story repurposed as source material for a fictional narrative that, while brilliant, ultimately obscured the true lessons of his failure beneath layers of psychological drama and dark comedy. In the end, Sam DeCavalcante achieved nothing that lasted. The money was seized or squandered, the political influence evaporated, the criminal empire disintegrated into a pathetic punchline, and his name is now primarily remembered as a footnote in television history. The plumbing supply business, the one truly legitimate venture, likely outlasted the entire criminal empire it was meant to front, a final, quiet irony. His story is therefore the ultimate cautionary tale, not just about crime, but about the nature of ambition and legacy itself. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that a legacy built on the suffering of others, on the corruption of institutions, and on the betrayal of the social contract, is no legacy at all. It is a castle built on sand, destined to be washed away by the tides of time and justice, leaving behind nothing but the faint, echoing whisper of what might have been, a sobering reminder that the true measure of a life is not the power accumulated or the fear instilled, but the positive and enduring mark one leaves on the world, a test that Sam DeCavalcante, for all his intelligence and ambition, failed utterly and completely. The story of Sam DeCavalcante, when finally stripped of its final layers of analysis and moral judgment, resolves into a simple, hauntingly human portrait of a man who, for all his power and notoriety, ultimately died as he lived, a prisoner. His first prison was one of his own making, the gilded cage of the criminal identity he constructed, a persona that demanded constant vigilance, perpetual suspicion, and the emotional isolation that comes from being the final arbiter of life and death for those within his orbit. This was a prison of the mind, where trust was a liability and every relationship was a potential calculation, a confinement that grew more suffocating with each passing year as the pressures of leadership mounted and the walls erected by the FBI began to close in. The second prison was the tangible one, the federal correctional institution with its concrete walls and regimented routines, a brutal and literal manifestation of the loss of the freedom he had so carelessly traded for power. Here, the man who had commanded the underworld of New Jersey was stripped of his authority, his custom suits replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit, his intricate financial schemes reduced to the mundane economy of the commissary. It was within this physical confinement that he was forced to bear witness to the third and most profound imprisonment, the life sentence of his legacy. From his cell, he received the devastating reports of his empire's implosion, each piece of news, a trusted capo turning informant, a lucrative racket falling to a rival family, the entire organization becoming a laughingstock, was another turn of the key in a lock he could never open. He was a captive audience to the demolition of his life's work, powerless to intervene as the structure he had architected was pillaged for parts and its reputation dragged through the mud of both the courtroom and the court of public opinion. And finally, with the premiere of The Sopranos, came the fourth and most ironic prison, his eternal confinement within a fictional narrative. His true story, the nuances of his strategic mind and the specific details of his criminal diplomacy, was forever overwritten by a sensationalized and psychologically driven drama. The man who had prized anonymity above all else was now permanently and incorrectly associated with a famously anxious and therapy-prone television character, his complex reality reduced to a creative inspiration, a piece of historical color. In this, he lost the final vestige of control over his own identity. So, Sam DeCavalcante died a prisoner many times over, a prisoner of his own choices, a prisoner of the state, a prisoner of his failed legacy, and a prisoner of a story that was no longer his own. His life stands as a stark testament to the fact that the most inescapable prisons are not built with bricks and mortar, but are forged from the consequences of our actions, the judgments of history, and the relentless, often inaccurate, interpretations of others. He sought to build an empire that would grant him ultimate freedom, but every step he took, every command he gave, every alliance he forged, only served to weave the bars of his cage more tightly, until at the end, there was nowhere left to look but inward, at the ruins of his own ambition, a life of immense potential that culminated in the quiet, profound, and total surrender to the consequences he himself had set in motion decades earlier on the streets of Elizabeth, New Jersey. The enduring enigma of Sam DeCavalcante, the question that continues to spark debate and analysis long after his passing, is not whether he was a success or a failure. The historical record makes the ultimate outcome tragically clear, but rather how to properly calibrate the scale on which we measure his life. A scale that must balance the undeniable magnitude of his criminal achievements against the utter desolation of his ultimate defeat. On one side of this balance, we must place the formidable accomplishments of his prime. The sheer logistical brilliance required to unify the warring factions of New Jersey's underworld into a single, disciplined organization, a feat of political and strategic genius that no one before or since has managed to replicate. We must account for his visionary understanding of the modern economy, his foresight in targeting labor unions and the construction industry as the primary vectors for infiltration and control, recognizing that the real power in post-war America lay not in street-level rackets but in the manipulation of legitimate capital and industry. We must weigh the profound respect he earned from the most powerful crime figures in the nation, men like Carlo Gambino, who viewed him not as a provincial underling but as a peer and a valuable strategic partner, a testament to his diplomatic skill and his reputation as a reliable, business-minded earner. This was the man who transformed New Jersey from a contested territory into a sovereign criminal state, a boss who operated with the calm authority of a Fortune 500 CEO, and whose organization became so emblematic of a certain kind of American criminal success that it inspired one of the most significant works of art in modern television. This is the weight of his rise, the impressive, almost awe-inspiring evidence of a unique and formidable talent applied with relentless focus. But on the other side of the scale, we must place the consequences, and here the weight is crushing and absolute. We must place the sheer totality of his downfall, not just his personal imprisonment, but the complete and humiliating disintegration of his empire, an organization that collapsed into a snake pit of informants and incompetence the moment he was removed from command. We must account for the thousands of lives negatively impacted by his reign, the businesses extorted, the union pensions looted, the lives lost to his orders, the families torn apart by the culture of violence and corruption he perpetuated. We must consider the historical verdict, which remembers him not for his strategic brilliance but for the shocking intimacy of his own wiretap downfall, a boss hoist by his own petard, his private frustrations and criminal conspiracies preserved for all time as a teaching tool for prosecutors and a cautionary tale for historians. And finally, we must weigh the bizarre fate of his legacy, his name forever linked to a fictional character, his true story obscured by a narrative that, while brilliant, is ultimately a work of fiction that focuses on the psychological rather than the criminal, the domestic rather than the corporate. When the scale is finally still, the conclusion is inescapable. The weight of the failure far outweighs the weight of the success. The empire, for all its power and profit, was a phantom, a temporary illusion of control that could not survive the absence of its creator or the scrutiny of the modern state. The legacy he so desperately wanted was not just lost, it was stolen, misappropriated, and fictionalized. The man who sought to build a dynasty left behind only a ruin and a footnote. The true measure of Sam DeCavalcante, therefore, is not found in the height of his rise, but in the depth of his fall, a chasm so profound and complete that it negates the achievements that preceded it, serving as the ultimate proof that a life dedicated to the pursuit of power through corruption is not a life of success, but a long, intricate, and ultimately tragic prelude to failure. The story of Sam DeCavalcante, in its entirety, ultimately transcends the specific details of his criminal enterprise to become a universal and timeless parable about the inherent fragility of power and the inescapable reality of consequence, a narrative that resonates not because of its uniqueness, but because of its stark demonstration of fundamental truths that apply to all human endeavors, regardless of their legal or moral standing. His life serves as a powerful case study in the limits of control, illustrating with brutal clarity that no individual, no matter how intelligent, disciplined, or ruthless, can ever hope to manage the infinite variables of a complex system, especially one populated by self-interested and unpredictable human beings. Sam's entire philosophy was predicated on control. Control over his territory, control over his soldiers, control over the economic levers of his criminal empire, and control over his public image as a legitimate businessman. For decades, he maintained this illusion of absolute command through a combination of strategic genius, calculated violence, and personal charisma, creating a world that appeared orderly and disciplined from the inside looking out. Yet, the FBI wiretaps revealed the terrifying truth that this control was a magnificent illusion, a performance he had to sustain every single day in the face of constant challenges, from the petty insubordinations of his crew to the grand strategic threats from New York. The moment he was removed from the center of his own web, the entire structure, which had seemed so formidable, unraveled with shocking speed, proving that the stability was not institutional but personal, a fragile equilibrium that depended entirely on his constant, wearying intervention. This lesson extends far beyond the underworld. It is a warning to any leader in any field who believes their organization is a perfect extension of their own will, a reminder that systems built around a single personality are inherently vulnerable and transient. Furthermore, his story is a profound meditation on the nature of legacy, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable question of how we wish to be remembered and what actions truly lead to an enduring positive impact. Sam DeCavalcante dedicated his life to building a legacy of power and respect, a name that would command fear and admiration for generations. He succeeded, in a perverse way, but not in the way he intended. His legacy is not one of reverence but of caution, His name is not synonymous with strength, but with the hubris of a man who believed he could outsmart the fundamental rules of society. He is remembered not for the empire he built, but for the way it fell, and for the uncomfortable mirror it holds up to our own fascination with power and the corrupting allure of the shortcut to success. His life screams a warning that echoes through time, that a legacy cemented with fear and washed with blood is no legacy at all, but a historical stain, a lesson in what to avoid. The millions of dollars, the political connections, the feared reputation, all of it evaporated, leaving behind only a story used to teach future G-men how to hunt and future screenwriters how to create compelling fiction. In the end, the most powerful and enduring aspect of Sam DeCavalcante's story is not the man himself, but the immutable principles his life demonstrates, that true power cannot be taken, only earned through legitimate consent, that true legacy cannot be built on the suffering of others, and that no amount of cunning or force can forever suspend the inevitable arrival of justice, which may be delayed by layers of secrecy and corruption, but which always arrives in the end, often in a form as quiet and undramatic as the turning of a tape recorder, patiently waiting to inscribe the final, truthful sentence in a story otherwise built on lies. The profound and unsettling silence that followed the final collapse of the DeCavalcante crime family speaks as loudly as any of the wiretap conversations that precipitated its fall. A quiet emptiness that stands in stark contrast to the decades of noise, ambition, and violence that once defined its presence in the New Jersey underworld. This silence is the true epilogue to Sam DeCavalcante's story, a void where once there thrived a complex and bustling criminal corporation, a palpable absence that serves as the ultimate testament to the transience of all forms of power that are rooted in fear and exploitation. The social clubs that once hummed with whispered conspiracies and the clinking of glasses in celebration of a successful racket were shuttered or taken over by legitimate businesses. The backroom offices where captains received their orders now house accountants or insurance agents, and the union halls that were once bastions of his influence now operate, however imperfectly, under the watchful eyes of federal monitors and a more skeptical membership. The very geography of his power, the streets of Elizabeth, Newark, and Kenilworth, now bear almost no visible trace of his reign, the physical world having absorbed and erased the footprints of his empire with the indifferent efficiency of time. This erasure is far more complete and damning than any historical condemnation could ever be, for it demonstrates that his life's work made no permanent mark on the world, beyond the negative space of its own disappearance. The men who once swore allegiance to him are either dead, imprisoned, or living out their days in the anonymous purgatory of the Witness Protection Program, their once feared names forgotten by all but a handful of historians and organized crime enthusiasts. The vast sums of money he accumulated were seized, squandered by his successors, or dissipated into the mundane expenses of legal defenses and family upkeep, leaving no lasting financial dynasty. The political influence he painstakingly cultivated evaporated the moment he was handcuffed, his phone calls no longer returned by the powerful men who had once been happy to take his money. This comprehensive vanishing act is the final and most powerful judgment on his career. It proves that an enterprise which produces nothing of value, which builds no lasting institutions, which contributes only to the corruption and fear within a society, cannot endure. It is a parasite that, when removed, leaves the host body to heal, with little evidence that it was ever there at all. The silence that now surrounds the name DeCavalcante is the sound of that healing, the quiet hum of normalcy returning to spaces that were once dominated by his shadow. It is a silence that screams the central truth of his saga, that the pursuit of power for its own sake, divorced from any higher purpose or moral compass, is the most ephemeral and futile of all human endeavors. A legitimate business, even if it fails, often leaves behind buildings, products, or intellectual property. A scientific discovery, a work of art, a charitable foundation, these things can echo through generations. Sam DeCavalcante left behind only a silence, a few boxes of FBI transcripts, and a fictionalized ghost that haunts the world of entertainment. His story is not one of a legacy, but of a lesson, a masterclass in the ultimate emptiness of a life dedicated to the proposition that might makes right, and that the rules of civilized society are merely suggestions for the weak. The silence is his true monument, and it is a monument to nothing. The ultimate philosophical reckoning of Sam DeCavalcante's life forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question that lies at the heart of the human experience. What is the true cost of a life lived in pursuit of a shadow, an existence dedicated to the accumulation of a power that is, by its very nature, illusory and self-cancelling? His story is not merely a chronicle of criminal enterprise. It is a profound and tragic exploration of wasted potential, a detailed map of a road taken that led, with absolute certainty, to a dead end. Every ounce of his considerable intelligence, every moment of his focus, every calculated risk he took, was invested in the construction of an edifice that was designed not to create, but to extract, not to build, but to control, not to contribute, but to dominate. The immense human energy expended, the late-night strategy sessions, the complex financial manipulations, the delicate diplomatic overtures to New York, the constant mental effort required to maintain a facade of legitimate business while overseeing a vast network of illicit activities, all of it was ultimately poured into a vessel with a hole in the bottom. For all the sound and fury, his life's work signified nothing in the end. It added no beauty to the world, provided no genuine security for his family in the long term, created no lasting value for his community, and advanced no cause other than the base accumulation of wealth and the installation of fear. When the final accounting was done, the balance sheet was not just in the red, it was a void. This is the true tragedy of Sam DeCavalcante, a tragedy far deeper than his imprisonment or the collapse of his family. It is the tragedy of misallocated genius, of a formidable human spirit that chose to channel its light into a black hole, where it was swallowed whole without a trace. Consider the alternative history, the path not taken. A man with his strategic mind could have been a brilliant corporate CEO, a formidable labor negotiator, or a transformative political figure. His ability to read people, to plan years in advance, and to manage complex, competing interests were skills that could have built a legitimate empire, created thousands of jobs, and left a legacy of innovation and progress. Instead, those same skills were used to corrupt unions, stifle legitimate competition through fear, and drain resources from the very economy he was a part of. He chose to be a parasite rather than a pioneer, a king of an underworld that, by definition, could never see the sun. This choice is what condemns him more than any specific crime. It was a choice for the ephemeral over the enduring, for the easy money of extortion over the hard work of creation, for the false respect born of fear over the genuine respect earned through contribution. His life thus becomes a somber meditation on the choices we all make and the values we choose to prioritize. It asks us to consider what we are building with our own time and talents, and whether the foundations of our ambitions are made of sand or stone. The haunting lesson of Sam DeCavalcante is that we are all building a legacy with every decision we make, and a legacy built on the suffering of others, on the corruption of institutions, and on the betrayal of the social contract, is not a legacy at all. It is merely a crime scene, waiting for the authorities to arrive, dust for fingerprints, and write the final report, a report that will ultimately be filed away and forgotten, a silent testament to a life that, for all its sound and fury, ultimately signified nothing. The final, overarching narrative of Sam DeCavalcante's life, when viewed from the distant, objective perch of history, resolves into a story not of crime and punishment in the simple, moralistic sense, but of a profound and systemic contradiction, a fundamental incompatibility between the archaic, tribal structure of the traditional mafia and the relentless, assimilating forces of modern American capitalism and jurisprudence. Sam was, in essence, a man caught between two eras, trying to impose the rules of a dying, feudalistic Sicilian world onto the dynamic, complex, and technologically advanced landscape of post-war America, and his downfall was the inevitable result of that cultural and historical collision. He operated with the mind of a modern CEO, but his tool for enforcement was the ancient code of the vendetta. He sought to build a corporate empire, but his pool of management talent was limited to a small, insular society of criminals bound by ethnicity and oath. He understood the power of public relations and legitimate fronts, but the core of his business remained murder, extortion, and theft. This internal conflict was a crack in the foundation of his entire enterprise, a flaw that the federal government, itself a manifestation of modern systemic power, was perfectly designed to exploit. The Mafia, at its heart, is a pre-modern institution, relying on personal loyalty, face-to-face communication, and the sanctity of oral tradition. The American state of the mid-20th century, however, was a leviathan of written law, electronic surveillance, and institutional memory. The FBI's wiretaps were the perfect symbol of this clash, an invisible, technological web that ensnared an organization that still conducted its most sensitive business in whispered conversations in social clubs and corner offices. Sam's attempt to create a hybrid entity, a corporate mafia, was brilliant but doomed, because the two elements were ultimately irreconcilable. The discipline required for a corporation is built on transparency and accountability within a legal framework. The discipline of the mafia was built on secrecy and violence outside of it. He could not have one without compromising the other. His insistence on financial prudence and low profiles for his men clashed with the gangster culture of flashy displays of wealth and machismo. His desire for stable, long-term growth through union control was constantly undermined by the short-term, violent ambitions of his soldiers and the unpredictable greed of his captains. He was trying to manage a group of pirates as if they were a fleet of merchant marines, and while his authority kept the pirates in line for a while, the inherent lawlessness of their nature eventually erupted, destroying the very supply lines he had worked so hard to secure. Furthermore, his sovereignty was always a fiction, tolerated by New York only so long as it was convenient. The five families were themselves vast, modernizing criminal corporations, and they would never truly permit a rival, independent state to flourish on their doorstep. Sam's diplomatic successes were a testament to his personal skill, but they did not change the fundamental power dynamic. New Jersey was, and would always be, a subsidiary in the eyes of the Commission, a fact that became painfully clear as his family disintegrated and New York families moved in to claim the pieces. In the end, Sam DeCavalcante was not defeated by a person or a single agency. He was defeated by the inexorable tide of modernity itself. The world became too transparent, too interconnected, too documented for his secret society to survive in its traditional form. The RICO statute was the legal embodiment of this new reality, a law that understood criminality as a systemic enterprise rather than a series of discrete acts. Sam was the last of a kind, the last boss who could genuinely believe he could build a lasting, autonomous criminal kingdom within the borders of the United States. His life and failure marked the historical pivot point where the romanticized, isolated world of the Mustache Pete's was finally and irrevocably consumed by the vast, impersonal, and all-seeing machinery of the modern state, a machinery that proved to be a far more efficient and ruthless corporation than anything the underworld could ever hope to assemble. And so, the story of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante concludes not with the dramatic finality of a gunshot, but with the lingering, sobering echo of a lesson learned too late, a cautionary tale etched not in stone but in the collective memory of a nation, a permanent reminder of the hollow victory that awaits those who confuse fear with respect, power with legacy, and a criminal empire with a lasting achievement. His journey, from the sun-drenched hills of Sicily to the gritty streets of Elizabeth, from the quiet authority of his plumbing supply office to the stark confines of a federal prison cell, serves as a complete and tragic arc, a Shakespearean drama played out not on the stage but in the real and consequential world of wiretaps, racketeering indictments, and shattered lives. We have followed his rise, a masterclass in strategic patience and underworld diplomacy that transformed a fragmented collection of thugs into a sophisticated criminal corporation, a silent partner in the economic life of New Jersey. We have listened in, through the ears of the FBI, to the inner workings of his reign, hearing the calm, reasoned voice of a CEO grappling with personnel problems and profit margins. A voice that could, in the same conversation, coldly authorize a murder, revealing the profound moral schizophrenia at the heart of his enterprise. We have witnessed his fall, a slow-motion collapse triggered by his own words, a victim of the very technology and legal innovation that defined the modern era he sought to exploit. We have seen his legacy crumble into dust, his organization devoured from within by betrayal and incompetence, his name forever entangled with a fictional narrative that, while brilliant, obscures the grim reality of his true story. And we have, in these final reflections, measured the immense cost of his choices, the wasted potential, the lives damaged, the communities corrupted, and the ultimate silence that now stands where his empire once roared. The man who sought to be a king died a prisoner, his kingdom revealed to be a mirage, his power exposed as an illusion. The final, unanswerable question his life poses is not about him, but about us, the audience to this history. What is it we truly seek when we are drawn to such stories? Is it the thrill of the illicit, the romance of the outlaw, the fascination with power operating in the shadows? Sam DeCavalcante's life, in its full, unvarnished context, offers no romance, only a grinding, anxious, and ultimately futile struggle for control in a world designed to shatter such ambitions. It offers no thrilling escape, only a sobering map of a dead-end street. His story is a gift of clarity, a powerful antidote to the poison of gangster glorification. It demonstrates with brutal, inexorable logic that the path of the criminal, no matter how intelligently walked, leads to one of only two destinations: a prison cell or a grave, and often, a legacy of shame and obscurity. The millions of dollars, the fleeting power, the feared reputation, none of it could purchase a single moment of genuine peace or secure a single, positive line in his historical epitaph. The tape reels have stopped turning, the courtrooms have fallen silent, and the man himself has passed into history. What remains is the lesson, a stark and enduring warning about the price of ambition untethered from morality, and the profound truth that the only legacies that endure are those built on creation, not extraction, on respect, not fear, and on light, not shadows. The story of Sam DeCavalcante is now complete. The rest is silence. If you found this deep dive into the rise and fall of a real American crime boss compelling, if it shed light on the dark corners of history beyond the fiction, then please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched documentaries, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the untold stories that shaped our world. The greatest tool we have against the glamorization of crime is the unflinching pursuit of truth. Share this video with others who appreciate real history, and let us know in the comments below which other enigmatic figures from history you would like us to investigate next. Thank you for listening. The ultimate philosophical reckoning of Sam DeCavalcante's life forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question that lies at the heart of the human experience. What is the true cost of a life lived in pursuit of a shadow, an existence dedicated to the accumulation of a power that is, by its very nature, illusory and self-cancelling? His story is not merely a chronicle of criminal enterprise. It is a profound and tragic exploration of wasted potential, a detailed map of a road taken that led, with absolute certainty, to a dead end. Every ounce of his considerable intelligence, every moment of his focus, every calculated risk he took, was invested in the construction of an edifice that was designed not to create, but to extract, not to build, but to control, not to contribute, but to dominate. The immense human energy expended, the late-night strategy sessions, the complex financial manipulations, the delicate diplomatic overtures to New York, the constant mental effort required to maintain a facade of legitimate business while overseeing a vast network of illicit activities, all of it was ultimately poured into a vessel with a hole in the bottom. For all the sound and fury, his life's work signified nothing in the end. It added no beauty to the world, provided no genuine security for his family in the long term, created no lasting value for his community, and advanced no cause other than the base accumulation of wealth and the installation of fear. When the final accounting was done, the balance sheet was not just in the red, it was a void. This is the true tragedy of Sam DeCavalcante, a tragedy far deeper than his imprisonment or the collapse of his family. It is the tragedy of misallocated genius, of a formidable human spirit that chose to channel its light into a black hole, where it was swallowed whole without a trace. Consider the alternative history, the path not taken. A man with his strategic mind could have been a brilliant corporate CEO, a formidable labor negotiator, or a transformative political figure. His ability to read people, to plan years in advance, and to manage complex, competing interests were skills that could have built a legitimate empire, created thousands of jobs, and left a legacy of innovation and progress. Instead, those same skills were used to corrupt unions, stifle legitimate competition through fear, and drain resources from the very economy he was a part of. He chose to be a parasite rather than a pioneer, a king of an underworld that, by definition, could never see the sun. This choice is what condemns him more than any specific crime. It was a choice for the ephemeral over the enduring, for the easy money of extortion over the hard work of creation, for the false respect born of fear over the genuine respect earned through contribution. His life thus becomes a somber meditation on the choices we all make and the values we choose to prioritize. It asks us to consider what we are building with our own time and talents, and whether the foundations of our ambitions are made of sand or stone. The haunting lesson of Sam DeCavalcante is that we are all building a legacy with every decision we make, and a legacy built on the suffering of others, on the corruption of institutions, and on the betrayal of the social contract, is not a legacy at all. It is merely a crime scene, waiting for the authorities to arrive, dust for fingerprints, and write the final report, a report that will ultimately be filed away and forgotten, a silent testament to a life that, for all its sound and fury, ultimately signified nothing. The final, overarching narrative of Sam DeCavalcante's life, when viewed from the distant, objective perch of history, resolves into a story not of crime and punishment in the simple, moralistic sense, but of a profound and systemic contradiction, a fundamental incompatibility between the archaic, tribal structure of the traditional mafia and the relentless, assimilating forces of modern American capitalism and jurisprudence. Sam was, in essence, a man caught between two eras, trying to impose the rules of a dying, feudalistic Sicilian world onto the dynamic, complex, and technologically advanced landscape of post-war America. and his downfall was the inevitable result of that cultural and historical collision. He operated with the mind of a modern CEO, but his tool for enforcement was the ancient code of the vendetta. He sought to build a corporate empire, but his pool of management talent was limited to a small, insular society of criminals bound by ethnicity and oath. He understood the power of public relations and legitimate fronts, but the core of his business remained murder, extortion, and theft. This internal conflict was a crack in the foundation of his entire enterprise, a flaw that the federal government, itself a manifestation of modern systemic power, was perfectly designed to exploit. The Mafia, at its heart, is a pre-modern institution, relying on personal loyalty, face-to-face communication, and the sanctity of oral tradition. The American state of the mid-20th century, however, was a leviathan of written law, electronic surveillance, and institutional memory. The FBI's wiretaps were the perfect symbol of this clash, an invisible, technological web that ensnared an organization that still conducted its most sensitive business in whispered conversations in social clubs and corner offices. Sam's attempt to create a hybrid entity, a corporate mafia, was brilliant but doomed, because the two elements were ultimately irreconcilable. The discipline required for a corporation is built on transparency and accountability within a legal framework. The discipline of the Mafia was built on secrecy and violence outside of it. He could not have one without compromising the other. His insistence on financial prudence and low profiles for his men clashed with the gangster culture of flashy displays of wealth and machismo. His desire for stable, long-term growth through union control was constantly undermined by the short-term, violent ambitions of his soldiers and the unpredictable greed of his captains. He was trying to manage a group of pirates as if they were a fleet of merchant marines, and while his authority kept the pirates in line for a while, the inherent lawlessness of their nature eventually erupted, destroying the very supply lines he had worked so hard to secure. Furthermore, his sovereignty was always a fiction, tolerated by New York only so long as it was convenient. The five families were themselves vast, modernizing criminal corporations, and they would never truly permit a rival, independent state to flourish on their doorstep. Sam's diplomatic successes were a testament to his personal skill, but they did not change the fundamental power dynamic. New Jersey was, and would always be, a subsidiary in the eyes of the Commission, a fact that became painfully clear as his family disintegrated and New York families moved in to claim the pieces. In the end, Sam DeCavalcante was not defeated by a person or a single agency. He was defeated by the inexorable tide of modernity itself. The world became too transparent, too interconnected, too documented for his secret society to survive in its traditional form. The RICO statute was the legal embodiment of this new reality, a law that understood criminality as a systemic enterprise rather than a series of discrete acts. Sam was the last of a kind, the last boss who could genuinely believe he could build a lasting, autonomous criminal kingdom within the borders of the United States. His life and failure marked the historical pivot point where the romanticized, isolated world of the Mustache Pete's was finally and irrevocably consumed by the vast, impersonal, and all-seeing machinery of the modern state, a machinery that proved to be a far more efficient and ruthless corporation than anything the underworld could ever hope to assemble. And so, the story of Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante concludes not with the dramatic finality of a gunshot, but with the lingering, sobering echo of a lesson learned too late, a cautionary tale etched not in stone but in the collective memory of a nation, a permanent reminder of the hollow victory that awaits those who confuse fear with respect, power with legacy, and a criminal empire with a lasting achievement. His journey, from the sun-drenched hills of Sicily to the gritty streets of Elizabeth, from the quiet authority of his plumbing supply office to the stark confines of a federal prison cell, serves as a complete and tragic arc, a Shakespearean drama played out not on the stage but in the real and consequential world of wiretaps, racketeering indictments, and shattered lives. We have followed his rise, a masterclass in strategic patience and underworld diplomacy that transformed a fragmented collection of thugs into a sophisticated criminal corporation, a silent partner in the economic life of New Jersey. We have listened in, through the ears of the FBI, to the inner workings of his reign, hearing the calm, reasoned voice of a CEO grappling with personnel problems and profit margins. A voice that could, in the same conversation, coldly authorize a murder, revealing the profound moral schizophrenia at the heart of his enterprise. We have witnessed his fall, a slow-motion collapse triggered by his own words, a victim of the very technology and legal innovation that defined the modern era he sought to exploit. We have seen his legacy crumble into dust, his organization devoured from within by betrayal and incompetence, his name forever entangled with a fictional narrative that, while brilliant, obscures the grim reality of his true story. And we have, in these final reflections, measured the immense cost of his choices, the wasted potential, the lives damaged, the communities corrupted, and the ultimate silence that now stands where his empire once roared. The man who sought to be a king died a prisoner, his kingdom revealed to be a mirage, his power exposed as an illusion. The final, unanswerable question his life poses is not about him, but about us, the audience to this history. What is it we truly seek when we are drawn to such stories? Is it the thrill of the illicit, the romance of the outlaw, the fascination with power operating in the shadows? Sam DeCavalcante's life, in its full, unvarnished context, offers no romance, only a grinding, anxious, and ultimately futile struggle for control in a world designed to shatter such ambitions. It offers no thrilling escape, only a sobering map of a dead-end street. His story is a gift of clarity, a powerful antidote to the poison of gangster glorification. It demonstrates with brutal, inexorable logic that the path of the criminal, no matter how intelligently walked, leads to one of only two destinations: a prison cell or a grave, and often, a legacy of shame and obscurity. The millions of dollars, the fleeting power, the feared reputation, none of it could purchase a single moment of genuine peace or secure a single, positive line in his historical epitaph. The tape reels have stopped turning, the courtrooms have fallen silent, and the man himself has passed into history. What remains is the lesson, a stark and enduring warning about the price of ambition untethered from morality, and the profound truth that the only legacies that endure are those built on creation, not extraction, on respect, not fear, and on light, not shadows. The story of Sam DeCavalcante is now complete. The rest is silence. If you found this deep dive into the rise and fall of a real American crime boss compelling, if it shed light on the dark corners of history beyond the fiction, then please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched documentaries, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the untold stories that shaped our world. The greatest tool we have against the glamorization of crime is the unflinching pursuit of truth. Share this video with others who appreciate real history, and let us know in the comments below which other enigmatic figures from history you would like us to investigate next. Thank you for listening. The ultimate philosophical reckoning of Sam DeCavalcante's life forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question that lies at the heart of the human experience. What is the true cost of a life lived in pursuit of a shadow, an existence dedicated to the accumulation of a power that is, by its very nature, illusory and self-cancelling? His story is not merely a chronicle of criminal enterprise. It is a profound and tragic exploration of wasted potential, a detailed map of a road taken that led, with absolute certainty, to a dead end. Every ounce of his considerable intelligence, every moment of his focus, every calculated risk he took, was invested in the construction of an edifice that was designed not to create, but to extract, not to build, but to control, not to contribute, but to dominate. The immense human energy expended, the late-night strategy sessions, the complex financial manipulations, the delicate diplomatic overtures to New York, the constant mental effort required to maintain a facade of legitimate business while overseeing a vast network of illicit activities, all of it was ultimately poured into a vessel with a hole in the bottom. For all the sound and fury, his life's work signified nothing in the end. It added no beauty to the world, provided no genuine security for his family in the long term, created no lasting value for his community, and advanced no cause other than the base accumulation of wealth and the installation of fear. When the final accounting was done, the balance sheet was not just in the red, it was a void. This is the true tragedy of Sam DeCavalcante, a tragedy far deeper than his imprisonment or the collapse of his family. It is the tragedy of misallocated genius, of a formidable human spirit that chose to channel its light into a black hole, where it was swallowed whole without a trace. Consider the alternative history, the path not taken. A man with his strategic mind could have been a brilliant corporate CEO, a formidable labor negotiator, or a transformative political figure. His ability to read people, to plan years in advance, and to manage complex, competing interests were skills that could have built a legitimate empire, created thousands of jobs, and left a legacy of innovation and progress. Instead, those same skills were used to corrupt unions, stifle legitimate competition through fear, and drain resources from the very economy he was a part of. He chose to be a parasite rather than a pioneer, a king of an underworld that, by definition, could never see the sun. This choice is what condemns him more than any specific crime. It was a choice for the ephemeral over the enduring, for the easy money of extortion over the hard work of creation, for the false respect born of fear over the genuine respect earned through contribution. His life thus becomes a somber meditation on the choices we all make and the values we choose to prioritize. It asks us to consider what we are building with our own time and talents, and whether the foundations of our ambitions are made of sand or stone. The haunting lesson of Sam DeCavalcante is that we are all building a legacy with every decision we make, and a legacy built on the suffering of others, on the corruption of institutions, and on the betrayal of the social contract, is not a legacy at all. It is merely a crime scene, waiting for the authorities to arrive, dust for fingerprints, and write the final report, a report that will ultimately be filed away and forgotten, a silent testament to a life that, for all its sound and fury, ultimately signified nothing. The final, overarching narrative of Sam DeCavalcante's life, when viewed from the distant, objective perch of history, resolves into a story not of crime and punishment in the simple, moralistic sense, but of a profound and systemic contradiction, a fundamental incompatibility between the archaic, tribal structure of the traditional mafia and the relentless, assimilating forces of modern American capitalism and jurisprudence. Sam was, in essence, a man caught between two eras, trying to impose the rules of a dying, feudalistic Sicilian world onto the dynamic, complex, and technologically advanced landscape of post-war America, and his downfall was the inevitable result of that cultural and historical collision. He operated with the mind of a modern CEO, but his tool for enforcement was the ancient code of the vendetta. He sought to build a corporate empire, but his pool of management talent was limited to a small, insular society of criminals bound by ethnicity and oath. He understood the power of public relations and legitimate fronts, but the core of his business remained murder, extortion, and theft. This internal conflict was a crack in the foundation of his entire enterprise, a flaw that the federal government, itself a manifestation of modern systemic power, was perfectly designed to exploit. The Mafia, at its heart, is a pre-modern institution, relying on personal loyalty, face-to-face communication, and the sanctity of oral tradition. The American state of the mid-20th century, however, was a leviathan of written law, electronic surveillance, and institutional memory. The FBI's wiretaps were the perfect symbol of this clash, an invisible, technological web that ensnared an organization that still conducted its most sensitive business in whispered conversations in social clubs and corner offices. Sam's attempt to create a hybrid entity, a corporate mafia, was brilliant but doomed, because the two elements were ultimately irreconcilable. The discipline required for a corporation is built on transparency and accountability within a legal framework. The discipline of the Mafia was built on secrecy and violence outside of it. He could not have one without compromising the other. His insistence on financial prudence and low profiles for his men clashed with the gangster culture of flashy displays of wealth and machismo. His desire for stable, long-term growth through union control was constantly undermined by the short-term, violent ambitions of his soldiers and the unpredictable greed of his captains. He was trying to manage a group of pirates as if they were a fleet of merchant marines, and while his authority kept the pirates in line for a while, the inherent lawlessness of their nature eventually erupted, destroying the very supply lines he had worked so hard to secure. Furthermore, his sovereignty was always a fiction, tolerated by New York only so long as it was convenient. The five families were themselves vast, modernizing criminal corporations, and they would never truly permit a rival, independent state to flourish on their doorstep. Sam's diplomatic successes were a testament to his personal skill, but they did not change the fundamental power dynamic. New Jersey was, and would always be, a subsidiary in the eyes of the Commission, a fact that became painfully clear as his family disintegrated and New York families moved in to claim the pieces. In the end, Sam DeCavalcante was not defeated by a person or a single agency. He was defeated by the inexorable tide of modernity itself. The world became too transparent, too interconnected, too documented for his secret society to survive in its traditional form. The RICO statute was the legal embodiment of this new reality, a law that understood criminality as a systemic enterprise rather than a series of discrete acts. Sam was the last of a kind, the last boss who could genuinely believe he could build a lasting, autonomous criminal kingdom within the borders of the United States. His life and failure marked the historical pivot point where the romanticized, isolated world of the Mustache Pete's was finally and irrevocably consumed by the vast, impersonal, and all-seeing machinery of the modern state, a machinery that proved to be a far more efficient and ruthless corporation than anything the underworld could ever hope to assemble.